This is one of the most recent Webb telescope images of the pillars of creation. It's dramatically different from this. You can the original, an earlier version with the Hubble, and then this is much richer, and it shows aspects like these areas here that are marked in red that were not seen before. Everything we're learning from the Webb is showing us what I predict. You could predict it, that it's going to reveal stuff that's going to be far more complex than you had thought. Always so. Now we realize we thought we had answers. We don't. There's an arrogance to suppose that we can get it all down and understand it all. So the God we serve is a God who continues to dazzle us with mystery and with wonder. And I just love that. So science is our agent, our not our enemy, and it really empowers us to see life in a new orientation. Before I began today, I just did this when I was sitting here. Trust the Father, abide in the Son, walk by the Spirit. And then I also did the other thing. What do you seek? Who am I to you? Who do you say I am? Do you love me more than these? Man, that's strong to do. And I want you to do that throughout the day. I've been trying to do it as many times as I can at various moments. I'm encouraging you to do that because I find it it kind of recalibrates. Just those two little exercises bring me back to a biblical perspective. Now, we're continuing on our journey through 12 Psalms. We've looked at Psalm 1 so far, and then 8, and then 19, and 103, 139. And as I told you, there is a method to my madness. But I'm not going to tell you that method until near the end. We did 139 last week, so now we're up to Psalm 22. Here's the problem with Psalm 22. The problem with Psalm 22 is that it's about adversity, and frankly, every time I teach on adversity, I get adversity. A friend of mine said, well, the simple solution is stop doing that. But I can't stop doing it because the scriptures give us a perspective that we're in a fallen world. We have no options. We have to encounter. So it's not a question of if. This is again, as I like to put it, suffering is not an elective in the university of life. It's a required course. And the issue is going to be, what does it do with us? How are we changed? Are we shaped? And are we brought into conformity with the image? And I'm trying to teach myself to thank God for the insights that grow out of adversity, you see. And if I can do that, because you'll never get them without pain. You can't get it in a fallen world. It's necessary. So we see this picture of a biblical response to adversity, which is kind of tripped off a number of things for me in my life. Now, this goes way back to 1992 is when I wrote this article here. But the fact is, I don't think I would have changed anything I said. You know, what's one of the things I love about biblical truth? It's evergreen. Biblical truth is evergreen. And it's always going to be relevant. And that's one of the wonderful things that's in contrast to the attempts to be woke and all the other kinds of attempts to accommodate the gospel to the culture, the prevailing winds of culture. And in an attempt, they do this in an attempt to be relevant, but ironically, they become irrelevant by doing that, because then they're taking their cue from the ambient culture rather than from the Word of God. And then they're just trying to adapt it, and then it just becomes a light spiritual veneer on the cultural agenda. No surprise then that they end up with answers that are not insightful, that are compromised. And so we are effectively seeing again that the Word of God causes us in some respects to be cultural subversives in this world. We are serving a different king, a different authority, and there's a different ruler, and therefore there's going to be a warfare. And as you know, when you go against the tide, you'll get noticed after a while. And the more serious you get, and this I think is a principle that you know is so, the more serious you get about growth, the more you attract the enemy's attention, and the more adversity you're going to encounter. And it's been a hard time for us with Reflections Ministries. Stuart and I have been talking about this challenge we've had with adversity. And we've both encountered serious degrees of that. And by the grace of God, He calls us to call upon Him, because you see, the question is going to be, how do you pray when you encounter adversity? Or how do you pray? And so there's two ways of praying, as we're going to see. Either ask the Lord to change your character or ask him to change your circumstances. You see, it seems to me that and it reminds me really of a card you've seen before, this little card that I have on the 4 whys of pain. If you'll recall, the first of the why of grumbling is totally useless and unbiblical. The sub-biblical thing is, why me? What have I done to deserve this? And the question, of course, is, why not you? You're in a fallen world. Don't be surprised when you encounter various adversities, as if it's some strange thing were happening to you. But the degree to which you share the sufferings of Christ, you are blessed, Peter tells us. So there's an orientation. So instead of asking that question, the why of grief, which we find in the Psalms of Lament, both individual and corporate Psalms of Lament in the Hebrew Bible. And when you see those, they cry out to God. And it's almost like it's an emotional thing, and they're set to music, of course, because it speaks to the heart. Why? Why is this happening? But it's different than the why of grumbling because it's not supposing that there's no answer. It's just I don't understand it. And so it's an emotional, and I think you need to do this. Just like a child comes to the father and says, why, or how is this happening? And they go to the father's lap and say, Daddy, why? And it's an understandable thing, Abba, Father. And so when you have that, it is good for us not to complain about God, but to complain to God. There's a big difference about that. You see, because effectively when we wrestle with God, and it seems like you're assaulting, it's really a kind of a engine against the Almighty, as George Herbert calls it. Prayer is an engine against the Almighty. It's a siege engine, like a catapult or like a battering ram against the forces of God, it would seem. But he invites us to pray and to do that, and it's a powerful thing, but it's also sinner's tower. It's a place where we can run into for defense. And so you have all these images. But grief, I think, is good and right and honest for us to offer our prayers and to assault the living God, as it were, with our hurt, and to look to him and realize, I know that you are the solution. But there's a third level, as we've seen, and it's the why of guidance. So instead of grief, the next level up, and not certainly eschewing grumbling, and grief can be useful. And I did that last night. I actually had a process last night of the why of grief. And it was a painful process, but it's a healing thing, and you have to do that from time to time, because you're not going to understand the answers, but you can understand that you can trust a person. And it always comes down to not so much understanding, but trusting. Who do you trust? Because you'll never understand even the fringes of his way. It's beyond comprehension. You know this. Anything you look at in the natural world is beyond your comprehension. Then how would it be if you tried to understand the mind of the Maker? So the third one is the why of grumbling, rather the why of guidance. And that's really what I was having in mind when I was saying, how do we ask? So the question here is then, instead of why is this happening, you convert that to the question is, what is the Lord teaching me in this experience? And that is a much more healthy perspective. And this is why I say openly invites God to change us rather than to change our circumstances. So you see that's very consistent with what I wrote in 1992. And then what's even more helpful, again, the most infrequent one is the one of gratitude, the why of gratitude, because this is powerful. And I think we need to train ourselves to ask this question more frequently than we do. That is to say, why have you been so good to me? Even in the midst of my pain and sorrow, I still realize that God has been great and gracious to me, and compared to the vast majority of people who've been on this planet or who are alive today, I have been given great freedoms and options and opportunities that very few people in history have ever enjoyed, and so have you. You didn't determine where you were born and when you were born. You didn't determine your abilities. It's all God's gift. So it's a question of what we do with that ability and how do we respond to him. So the why of gratitude is so powerful, because why have you been so good to me is the question that I'm inviting you to consider as we focus on this. Ask him, therefore, to change your character than to change your circumstances with the why of guidance. So instead of the why, you turn it to what do you want me to learn? Because if he removes the pain prematurely, then you'll not learn from it. So there's a process you need to go through that's necessary, and only God knows how much you need, when you need it, and what the circumstances are. So you have to trust him that if the one who pursued you and purchased you with his own blood, can you trust someone who died for you? Someone who gave his life for you? Someone who pursued you when you were his enemy? That's impossible. You don't see this. Yes, it may be that with humans, it may be that we can love even people who are our enemies, but it's very difficult. It's usually a hard thing for us to do. But God's the one who pursues us and loves us, and even while we were his enemies, he died for us. And so what I'm suggesting with these times is that he can use these times to reveal our deepest needs and draw us near to him. And so that's how I see it in this respect. We've seen this quote, and this is where I quoted it back in 1992 from The Problem of Pain. You all know this quote, don't you? Or you're supposed to know this quote. Do you know this quote? God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Those are words that are worthy of reflection and repetition because it is his vehicle. Although that said, though, I often tell people, train yourself to listen to his whispers. Enjoy him in the pleasures of life and not waiting just for sterner measures, because there's always gracious movements that we often overlook otherwise when we won't note them. So circumstances versus character. Even before I go into this great psalm, I'm giving you a perspective, this Psalm of David. And it's in this great psalm that we're considering here, we're realizing that this is a messianic psalm, Psalm 22. It is for the choir director, and he gives us some Hebrew term for what kind of instruments or musical notation, but we don't really know what that entailed. But it involved, though, the emotional life, not just the intellectual life. It speaks to the heart, the deeper level, and that's why the music comes in, because as you know, the Psalms bring us from the depths of despair to the heights of joy. But this is a psalm both of lament and sorrow, but it's also a psalm of praise, and it moves us from one to another. And so we're going to go through this very briefly, but you can see immediately David's psalm, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that should be rather familiar to you because, in fact, it is a messianic psalm. And he's talking about things that transcend his own experience as a shepherd, a man who has been given by the grace of God prophetic utterance here, that this psalm then speaks about the glories of Christ and the sufferings of Christ and the glory that would follow. So he speaks about the suffering and the glory, and so we'll see more about that in just a moment. But going back to this idea then, God does not promise that his children, I want to talk about this as well. Not just, how do you pray? Change your circumstances or change your character? See, that's a bold prayer. Change my character so that I can become more conformed to the image of your Son. And use this for your purpose rather than me pushing back against your purposes. It's a submission that's involved that requires that. And so the second part, though, is God's deliverance from versus deliverance through. He doesn't promise that his children will be exempt from tribulation. That's very clear. It's not that we are going to be delivered from suffering, but that he will deliver us and transform us through the things we suffer if we rely on his resources instead of our own. So it's really a deliverance through that pain and that sorrow and that suffering. It's been called the fifth gospel because of the account of the crucifixion. Although it's a psalm of David, its imagery transcends David's experience. So again, to use the language of 1 Peter 1:1, that the Spirit of Christ was speaking about the prophets who would speak about these things, spoke about the sufferings of Christ and the glories that would follow. And the sufferings of Christ are verses 1 to 21, the first half of the psalm. And the glories that would follow are 22 to 31. And so it ends up with praise, you see, so just to get a perspective. And as a prophet, then David looked ahead and he spoke of the Christ, as it says in Acts. And so, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Immediately comes to our minds this awesome and mysterious moment that the Son becomes the bearer of the sins of the world and endures separation from the Father so we could have forgiveness and access and peace with the Father. The text that comes to my mind, 2 Corinthians 5:21, because in this text we see the one who had no sin became sin on our behalf, so we could become the righteousness of God. So again, we take our sins and my life. I look at my account. What are my thoughts, words, and deeds? It adds up to sin, which falls short of the glory of God, anything contrary to his glory. I look at Christ's thoughts, words, and deeds. It adds up to righteousness. And when I see that perfection in this text, it's telling me that he made him who had no sin to become sin. How could this happen? And the extraordinary grace and gift at the cross when he bears our sins and therefore is somehow mysteriously separated from the Father and says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Knowing before all this would happen that would be the awful burden that he would have to bear. Yet he says, behold, I'm willing to do this. Unlike a sacrificial offering where they're tied to the altar, here's one who actually goes up willingly to the altar. And for one sacrifice for all time, never requiring future sacrifices. When he ended, then there was the death of death, and it was the beginning of life for us. But it's not the whole, because not only was he separated from the Father, but he also somehow, mysteriously, miraculously gives us his righteousness. That's the part I can't grasp. He takes the very thing that condemned us, which is imputed sin. And now he takes our sin and imputes it to us. Our sin is imputed to him instead of our own. And then he not only does that, but he doubles the imputation. And the second imputation, the double imputation, is he imputes his righteousness upon us. So he takes the very principle that condemned us and doubles it up and actually leverages that. So it's the vehicle by which he could be just and the justifier of those who have faith in Christ Jesus. That God does not compromise his standards. It is, in fact, a moral and spiritual world. Somebody has to pay. At the end of the day, no one gets away with evil. Not permanently. Maybe in this life, we see it all the time, but not in the next. So at the end, there's payday someday, to use the name of a famous sermon. Payday someday, R.G. Lee. It's a great sermon. You want to hear it sometime. It's really, really good. But you can look it up on YouTube, and it's terrific. But the point is, God is not mocked. But he gives us an option we didn't have. Either we bear it or he bears it for us. And so there's the miracle and wonder that's described in this text. And so it's beyond imagination. But then the third component of this psalm is that it goes from petition to praise. And this is where I want to just make some comments about this. So he turns to God during his time of trial, and he fixes his hope fully and completely on him in verses 4-5 then. So we see, far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer. And by night, but I have no rest. Yet you are holy. O you who are enthroned upon the praises of Israel, and you our fathers trusted. They trusted you, and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were delivered. And you they trusted and were not disappointed. But I'm a worm and not a man, a reproach of men and despised by the people. All who see me sneer at me. You can see the imagery of the crucifixion and how they mocked him, saying, come down from the cross if you're the Son of God. They separate with the lip. They wag their head, saying, commit yourself to the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him because he delights in him. Yet you are he who brought me forth from the womb. You made me trust when upon my mother's breast, and upon you I was cast from birth. You've been my God from my mother's womb. So here's David speaking, but he's speaking also about elements that transcend his own experience. So it is Davidic, but it's beyond Davidic. You see, it's a messianic psalm. So it's both David's experience, but he is used as well as a vehicle, as a prophet who is now describing something far beyond his own experience. But you know that he's had these experiences to one degree or another. Many bulls have surrounded me. I say, open wide their mouth at me as a ravening and pouring lion. roaring lion. I'm poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. Again, it's an image of crucifixion, which is what would have happened. My heart is like wax. It's like my tongue cleaves to my jaws. And remember, I thirst. Dogs have surrounded me, the Gentiles. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and from my clothing they cast lots. Pretty obvious, isn't it? Yeah. This, as you know, along with Isaiah 53, are the two clearest texts from the Hebrew Bible that really give us a portrait of what God was bringing about. But even then, they couldn't get it. It's no one could imagine that the Messiah, who's described as the reigning coming king, but there's another image of a Messiah as a suffering servant. No one guessed that they'd be one and the same. No one guessed that he would come first in suffering and in humility, and then he'll come back in greatness and in judgment. But no one could have guessed that. We are privileged to see things that others were not able to see, but now we can see them, and we're responsible with this revelation to how do we respond to it. And so he cries for God's help. But then you see another thing taking place here as we go back into the text, because you see, we realize that Jesus turns to the Father. As I say, oft during such times, as I put it, many people turn to the pill bottle, the liquor bottle, or the back door when they are in trouble. Often they'll turn to those three resources, and they'll never find relief from those vehicles, because God never scripts life the way you want. And I get weary of fighting against that. I have good ideas. I think I know what would be best for my ministry. I really do think I know how this thing should work. Why won't he hear it? It's pretty obvious. But it never seems to work that way. So I'm finding myself almost as an adversarial relationship, and yet I know that's not the case. He wants what's best for me. I have a history of that. But even so, even now, I will struggle as I do. So the real question is, I have to faith it, to use that phrase. Faithing it means that you know he'll never script life the way you want it. Because you know, if you're honest, you don't know what your best interests look like, though you fondly suppose you do. And I have a fond supposition of what my best interests look like. And I give, in my prayers, as you know, I like to put it this way sometimes. Prayer is like a strategy session in most people's lives, in which they tell God what they want him to do and give him generous suggestions as to when and how to accomplishment, because you know better than that. And so the prayer is more of a manipulative strategy session than it is actually to transform our devices and desires to submit to his desires for our life. So true prayer is not getting God to do what you want, but instead to hear what he wants. So that you begin to realize it's a matter of submitting to him, his will, not for God to do what I want. So I have to recalibrate what he wants. And sometimes in that darkness of despair, it is through that pain that I will sometimes, by the grace of God, break through and have these understandings that I otherwise would not have had. So then we have verses 6 to 18, as I mentioned, the graphic experience of that. But then, this is funny as I look at this, because I realized I had to make the type font smaller because I was running out of space, you see. So that's how I did it. That's why that font is smaller, because I was running out of space. But while the psalmist was delivered from death, the Lord Jesus was delivered through death in his glorious resurrection. So the idea is that you will either be, how will you be delivered? Will it be from and through? But again, we recognize as we go from petition to praise that ultimately we will be delivered. And it will be how God does it is going to be in his good hands. So the idea of this is to realize in Romans 8:18 that I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. This is what I have to keep going back to, that eternal perspective, especially when I'm going through trials, doubts, difficulties, and so forth. It's not wrong to doubt. It's one who has to wrestle with that and wrestle before God, though. And it's wise to do that and be honest before him. This doesn't make sense. I can't make any kind of order out of this. But then I have to back off and realize that any time I've obeyed God, though, I've not regretted it in the long run, you see. And any time I've gone against God, you know the answer. I've always regretted it in the long run. So it should be obvious, and yet we continue to be trained in righteousness. And God's supreme purpose in our earthly adversities, as I wrote, is to gradually conform our character to Christ, and also to prepare us for our true homecoming when we'll see him face to face. And that is really the lesson for all of us, but it's a necessary good for us to see. So when I consider what that looks like then in my own life, I have to ask these questions then, and I'm going to have you ask these questions around your table. First of all, what do I look at? What do I ask for? Circumstances? Change the circumstances or change the character? Examples. We have plenty of them, and I bet you'll be able to summon many of them. And the other one is deliverance from versus deliverance through, you see. And God is no guarantee he's going to deliver you from something, but there is a guarantee, his promise. He will carry you safely to the other side now that you're in him. And the third thing I want you to think about is how do we move from petition to praise in our thoughts, our lives, our experiences as we process this journey together of moving really from the lament to the longing, to moving from a sense of despair to a sense of desire. You see, that you move to what do you really long for? What do you desire? So it goes right back to where I started this morning. What do you seek? Who am I to you today? Do you love me more than these? So let's have a little time around the table. Let's see what insights that we have. Jake, if you wouldn't mind sharing just a brief summary of some of that, was very, very helpful. We were in our group, and Jake is in my group because he monitors this. We came up with a good summary. We're going to actually put together a little article based upon this, Jake, and then Phil Smith, who's a psychologist, professional psychologist, and there's a pattern that makes sense.
So I work as a trauma resolution counselor, and something I found is that when he was talking about actually, if you could put it up.
Let me put the whys up there, the why of...
the why of grief, he said that it can be useful. And we were talking about how it's probably actually necessary because when we go through a trauma, for example, and trauma is defined as something that's outside of our control, that contradicts our expectations, values, or beliefs. And so, if you imagine something like you're a kid, your dad had a bad day at work, and he comes home and he's drinking, and he yells at you and hits you and blames you for something that was, not your fault. And that sticks with a kid, right? And so they should go through the stages of grief. And if those get stopped or short-circuited, then they get stuck there until it's resolved. And that could last for years, decades, their whole life. And the stages of grief starts with shock, right? When the incident happens, it's outside of their control. Their brain is shocked, doesn't know what to do with it. And then it goes into denial, and then anger turned inward, and then anger turned outward, and then acceptance, and then resolution. And in serious traumas, people usually don't get there on their own all the way to the end. And so you'll see, for example, somebody who's more narcissistic or victimizes themselves a lot, they'll generally get stuck in the anger turned outward. So even, our natural human bent would be to go straight to the anger turned inward because it's the natural grieving process where we blame ourselves first, right? If you were the kid in that incident, then you'd say, I'm so stupid. Dad said, Dad's not proud of me. I must be worthless. Those kind of thoughts. So when Ken was talking about, first how this can be useful, and also how, it's more helpful to focus on what's wrong in our character instead of our circumstances, because focusing on the circumstances would be that anger turned outward and just getting stuck there. And another piece we were talking about was how, as we have been walking as Christians for longer, sometimes we can feel like we've been on this journey for a long time. We should be growing spiritually, and so we should be faster at this. We should be able to, not do the process that David's going through in the Psalms, where he's wrestling with his doubts and crying out to God and being upset. By doing that, we actually sometimes can just get stuck in the denial phase and skip all the processes of the grieving process and just be stuck in denial because we want to skip past and not have to be angry at ourselves and angry at the circumstances around us. But it's kind of the way our brains are wired to need to go through all those things. And people think by talking generally. So that's why through prayer or through having somebody else who's willing to listen without giving unsolicited advice and just be mostly a sounding board can really help us work through it and grieve properly.
Very helpful. And so I just invited Jake to write that out. It's very, very insightful. And then Phil Smith, who was on the call, will look it over, and the three of us will be happy to put something together. I'd like to make that available to people because I think we all struggle with this. And sometimes the inward anger turned inward and then the anger turned outward. Knowing that there are classic steps and processes that we see, it's helpful for you to understand, where am I in this? So you can help you with your own assessment of your pain or your situation. Am I processing this in a healthy and biblical way? And I think that could be very valuable. So that little session then will birth an article. I think that could be very valuable. We still have a few minutes. Any other thoughts? Yes, Dennis.
As Kim, we were discussing deliverance from as opposed to deliverance through.
Yes.
I learned something some time ago that when I encounter problems over which I have no control, rather than praying for deliverance from, I do pray for deliverance through and do it in this fashion. Lord, I'm having trouble with this now. Don't let me get out of this until I learn what you have for me to learn.
Yeah, that's the wisdom that we're talking about.
I don't want to learn this twice.
And that brings us to the why of guidance. I don't need to learn this twice. Let me not kick against the goads, and let me just learn from this. That's the why of guidance. So you're moving from grief to guidance. And then the ending would be lovely, gratitude. Ending with gratitude. So you start with grief and go to gratitude. It's not a bad process, is it? But you don't want to skip the steps. There are insights that are helpful for us to realize. And as you go through it, you realize it on different levels. You'll see the same thing, but as you're the different person. So it's not as if it's happening over and over again, but actually you're a different person in that process, so that there's a kind of it's not just recurring, but you're growing in it. So there's cycles, but there's also movement in a direction of growth, because you're going to go through these patterns again and again, because they're needful, these patterns and processes, I think, for our growth. You see, in many ways, in our prayers, we're asking God to love us less than He does. He loves us more than we love ourselves in many ways, and so we would accept the lesser good. You see, I'd rather just be a thumbnail sketch than a magnum opus, than the artist's greatest work. Because over the magnum opus, over his greatest work, he labors so hard and he scrapes the painting, the canvas, and it's agony. So you'd rather it's good enough. Never good enough, because he wants what's better for you than you would choose for yourself. But you need to submit to the Master's hand to become the excellence, the beauty, the wonder that he intends you to become.